Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here today is acclaimed chef Chris McDonald, joining us on the program to talk about a very unique cooking technique known as Sous Vide. It is something that is done in fine restaurants from around and can be done affordably at home. You do this simply by immersing food in hot, not boiling water that's temperature controlled in a water bath for long periods, which can result in the juiciest, most succulent, and tender meat, and you name it. It's just an amazing cooking technique, and it's something that you'll actually want to share and entertain friends with as well. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Chris McDonald. Chris, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
My pleasure, Dan.
Sous vide, how did all this start? I've never heard of this cooking technique before.
Well, this started in the 60s, actually, in France, of course, where a lot of things, cooking start. But in restaurants, in fact, in a three-star restaurant in near Lyon. And then it was quickly adapted for the first-class train travel to do multiple quantities of food, to do batch cooking. But it's become a thing in the last 15 or so years in restaurants, much more popular because the equipment is now became available.
Now, tell us about the technique itself. What exactly happens here?
Well, you're cooking. You're applying heat to food in a more or less traditional fashion. It's not like microwave or anything, but you're cooking your food in an enclosed container, usually a plastic bag or pouch, in water that is heated to a very precise temperature. So the equipment that you need is this heater of water that can hold the water at a very exact temperature.
Now, what was it about Sous Vide that got you interested in trying this particular technique?
Well, it's a sort of a three-star restaurant technique that's been around for a while, and it allows you to cook things extremely precisely. You can cook things below the normal temperature that you would safely cook food because you're holding it at a precise temperature for long enough that the food is safe to eat. Now, when we talk about protein, meat and fish, chicken, and so forth, the lower temperature will allow you to have juicier products, juicier food.
Now, it's pretty interesting because a lot of times people really try to master things such as barbecuing, especially when it comes to things like steaks or perhaps even roast, but this is a way that's really a lot different because of the way that it evenly cooks things. That's pretty interesting.
Well, you can't really tell the doneness of the food so well because it's in a pouch. So you need to rely on sort of times and temperatures, either by experience or with my book, for instance, which will give you the times and temperatures you need for a given cut of meat or vegetable, what have you, and depending on what size it is.
I think it's pretty interesting because you take a look at this and how it's an excellent time management way of cooking that, of course, it frees up things where you can prepare food in advance, you can chill it until it's ready to serve, and then all you got to do is just kind of quickly reheat it. It's pretty interesting.
Yes, I mean, it works very well that way. It also can replace your slow cooker, your crock pot arrangement. A lot of things you'll be cooking, you're going to cook for 8 to 16 hours. So you cook things overnight. You can get things started in the morning, and then when you come home from work, it's ready to eat, that sort of thing.
Now, what type of, equipment is required, for using this particular method?
Well, to do it properly, you need, as I said, some sort of device that will hold a given water bath at a precise temperature. Now, there's basically two styles of devices. There are devices that are like water ovens that have their own bath, and they have basically like a heating pad that surrounds a metal vessel, usually a rectangular vessel, that you fill with water, and then the heating pad that's built into the unit will control the temperature of the water. So it relies on the convection currents through the the water as the heat comes from the walls and rises through the water. The second device style is called an immersion circulator, and this is something that looks like an immersion blender sort of thing. They're a bit larger, and they have a pump and a heater in them, as well as a thermostat, of course. And these you clamp to the side of a container, and that can be just a large stock pot, for instance, or you can have like a polycarbonate container that you clip the side to, or a picnic cooler, for instance, you could attach to the side, and then you fill that with water, and the water circulates and is heated by this immersion circulator.
Now, it's really interesting because this is something that people can consider when it comes to working with tougher and less expensive cuts of meat, let's say. Tell us about how that works.
Well, it's about how proteins behave with the application of heat. So if you take something like ossobuco, which is usually with a veal shank, it's an Italian preparation. You cook it very slowly. It would typically be braised in the oven at a low temperature, but still it's going to be bubbling away. So that means that the meat is sitting in a liquid while it's braising at about the boiling point of that liquid, with the boiling point of water, for instance. With sous vide, we have the opportunity to put all the flavorings that you would put in the braise in the plastic pouch with the ossobuco, for instance, the veal shanks, which are a very tough cut, but become very succulent when they're properly cooked. And you can cook this now in the water bath at a temperature far below the boiling point of the water, and that keeps the meat a lot juicier. If you were cooking it in a traditional fashion, you might cook it for 1.5 to 2.5 hours if you're braising it in the oven. If you're cooking it in this fashion, you'll probably be cooking it 12 to 16 hours. So it's cooked at a much lower temperature for a much longer time, and what ends up happening is the meat is way juicier. And this is also something that we professional chefs do in restaurants.
That's pretty interesting because it comes to mind, there was a friend of mine who actually worked and was partial owner of a wine bar restaurant. And one of the things they liked working with was duck. And he was telling me, and it's funny now that I think about it in retrospect because I didn't consider at the time how similar it is to what we're talking about here today, but he says one of the things they would do with duck breast, for instance, is they would put them, submerge it in water, and it would be just below boiling. But he says, once you do this with this particular, meat, it's really interesting that you can store it for almost ever, he said. And, you just go and you reheat it, and it would be just as juicy as if you were cooking it fresh. And I didn't think about it before until this came along, and I thought, wow, here was that cooking technique that was actually just right there in front of me.
Well, there are many recipes for duck in my sous vide book, and in fact, that's correct. Like here, we would have a much more controlled temperature even than that. Simmering is about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and you might be cooking your duck here at 150 degrees, so you're 30 degrees lower than that. But in fact, once it's fully cooked in this sealed pouch, you chill it in an ice water bath, and you put it in the fridge, and it's got a shelf life of 5 or 6 days at least. So you do have that, and then when you're ready to have it, you could either take the duck out of the bag, the duck breast, and brown it quickly on the outside, and when you're browning it, it'll warm through. Or you can take it and re-immerse it in the water bath for a short period of time, let's say 15 or 20 minutes, to get it hot through, and then just pop it out of the bag and eat it. So it's really handy. It's a time saver, and you end up with juicy products.
Now, what was interesting, too, as I was looking through the book, is that one of the, equipment pieces you talk about is the use of, like, for instance, jars. Tell us about how that works.
Well, a typical, the jars that you would use, or the jars that I use and recommend you use, are the typical canning jars with either the 2-piece lids or a 1-piece lid even you can use, but the canning jars. And if you use, for instance, a straight-sided small canning jar, you can cook. You can make like a creme caramel in the canning jar. So you would put for creme caramel, you usually line a mold with caramel, and then let that cool and harden, and then you pour in a custard mix, and then you bake them in a water bath in the oven. And it can be a little tricky. It's hard to catch them just not undercooked, like just properly cooked. And there's always a fear that you overcook them, and then the eggs start to get grainy. So you can do the exact same thing in a small canning jar, screw the lid on tight, and then submerge them in your water bath. And because you pick an exact precise temperature that the eggs will cook to, you can't overcook your eggs. So it's very handy for egg cookery, and that's a typical example of cooking in the jar. And then you can just unmold it from the jar right onto the plate.
I know. I was noticing that in the book, and I thought to myself, boy, this would be pretty interesting for people who are wanting to do perfect eggs Benedict, for instance.
Yes, and you can also around this time of year, it's great for gifts because you can make a terrine or pâté mix and put it into jars, pack it down in the jars, and then cook the pâté in the jar, and then you've got something you can take to a party.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting because this is something that once you've nailed the time and the temperature down, that you can actually count on consistent results, which is really huge for cooking. I don't know how many people out there who have actually said, well, I'm going to go ahead and make this, but then it turns out different each time they do it.
Well, it's kind of interesting because in a way, I liken it a little bit to barbecue because it's kind of up till now, it's become, with home chefs, it's become popular as a kind of a male thing because it's kind of gear related, it's equipment related, the way a barbecue is kind of a guy's thing. And but as opposed to, as we said earlier, with barbecue, you've got to really know what you're doing and probe it with thermometers, and it takes a lot more experience. With this, you just have to base your recipe on the size of your food and the nature of your food, and then that will give you a time and a temperature, and those results will be consistent time and again.
Now, what was this about when you first got involved with this particular style of cooking that really got your interest, and what can you share with us that you would think really surprises you about it?
Well, I mean, I'm a professional chef, so I got started with it for a lot of the convenience to use it in a commercial context. But as I said earlier, I think that the main delight for it is this ability to keep your meats and fish juicy and not overcook them. So that can be, even in an experienced cook, a real advantage. With vegetables, you have normally, for instance, when you cook asparagus, you cook it in a big pot of boiling water. Well, a lot of that water, a lot of the flavor from the asparagus ends up in the water. In this case, you put your asparagus spears, maybe with a little butter or olive oil, into a pouch. You seal the pouch, and you cook it at actually a rather high temperature, but it's not boiling because it's just slightly below boil at a simmer in this water bath, and all the flavor stays in the asparagus. So you get actual kind of a super asparagus flavor. It's like Technicolor.
Outstanding. It's pretty interesting, and I understand that this is actually an ideal method for people who like to travel a lot.
Well, you can take the immersion circulators can fit in your luggage, and a lot of people are, if they're going to a Airbnb in a foreign place for a few days, or they're renting a house on the beach, they can put this in their luggage. If they don't know what they're going to come up against in a rental unit, they can rely on Sous Vide to cook at their location. Conversely, you can portion and cook your steaks ahead, for instance, and take them in a picnic cooler. They're already in a plastic pouch. You can take them to a barbecue, and all you have to do is brown them on the outside, and there you go.
Now, when it comes to actually being able to work with this particular technique, how long would you say somebody who hasn't experienced this, do you think it would take for them to get a feel for it?
I think with my book, You unpack your equipment on Friday. By Sunday night, you're cooking for your family, and they're delighted with the results. The book is just out now, and I've been giving it to a few of my friends that are not professional chefs, and they're calling me the next day saying, "Boy, Chris, this is amazing! I can't believe the steak I just cooked." So it's a pretty quick learning curve for the simple, basic recipes of chicken breasts or a pork chop or a steak or a salmon fillet. You can do it kind of right out of the box.
It's so interesting too, because this is one of those things I always encourage people. You want to learn to cook, and sometimes I'll even get a confused look like, well, why would I want to do that? And I said, well, just imagine that you get to prepare your favorite food, better than anybody in the world, so to speak. And to be able to have these particular techniques available at your fingertips to be able to learn, is pretty exciting. And the creativity that's involved when it comes to cooking is it's an amazing stress relief, and it's pretty exciting stuff, isn't it?
Well, if you can get the technique out of the way with the sous vide equipment, then you can focus on being creative. You can't really be creative until you know how to cook. It's like a lot of things. It's like playing the piano. Once you have some technique, then you can start being creative. So in a way, sous vide jump starts you, so that you can take yourself to a point where you can start inventing your own dishes. And the way I've designed this sous vide book is that I'm tried to cover, there's a lot of recipes in this book, over 200, and I'm tried to cover all the different scenarios, for instance, of dishes. For instance, there's a quail dish in there, and there's only one, but that gives you a time and a temperature and the procedures for handling quail in a sous vide approach. So with that information, then you can go on and create your own quail dish because you know how to cook the quail sous vide.
And there it is, because a lot of times when people come to, for instance, when it comes to cooking poultry, if you will, is that they tend to get to a point where they just dry it out to death, especially if you're barbecuing. And that was one of the complaints I know my wife was telling me about. She says, barbecued chicken, every time I have that, and she actually got on me one time about it when I was barbecuing chicken. I really don't like barbecued chicken, for instance, because it's always dry. And I said, don't worry about it. I do a slow smoke. But, when it comes to barbecuing, that's something that takes a little bit of time, and a learning curve to do. But, with something like this, you can kind of come, it seems like, right out of the gate and kind of do it right, without really making too many mistakes, it seems like.
Exactly. Sous vide really helps you there. And, I think that a lot of people struggle with fish, for instance. And so with sous vide, you can cook your fish and keep it juicy and not dry out and falling apart on you.
Now, how many recipes do you feature in the particular book that we're talking about here today?
The book has about 190 sous vide recipes, and then 30 or 40 kind of support recipes, pesto and breadcrumbs and so forth, recipes for things that you need to do the sous vide recipes in the book. But so you're looking at over 200 recipes in this book.
Now, is there a website people can find out more if they want to be able to get a hold of the book or things like that?
Well, the book's going to be available on at Amazon in the next day or two, and in the major bookstores. So it's going to be out before Christmas in a lot of locations. There's no website per se for this book.
Now, I think I like that you said that, because it's really interesting when it comes to cooking sometimes, especially things that to people seem complicated. I remember years ago when I was working in this little place and I decided to whip up fettuccine Alfredo, for instance. And, and I told them, well, no, this is how you actually make this. And it was funny, the comments that I got was, well, I thought this was just some long, complicated process. And it's interesting the perceptions that people have when it comes to cooking, and you take a look at, for instance, sous vide, and you realize, my goodness, this is, pretty simple stuff when you think about it.
Well, this book is to demystify all of this, and it's good for beginner cooks and experienced cooks alike. And the recipes in the book reflect that. I mean, there's some very simple, straightforward recipes just to get you a good chicken, steak, or fillet of fish. And then there's also a whole bunch of kind of interesting restaurant quality creative recipes as well.
Very good, Chris. I want to thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today. The book is The Complete Sous Vide Cookbook. Our guest, Chris McDonald. Chris, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you, Dan. It was a pleasure.
You bet.
Okay.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Now you've got a new Christmas item for that inspiring cook that you know of out there. Get the Complete Sous Vide Cookbook. Very enjoyable stuff. If you want to discover more, you can also visit us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Stay up to date with what's going on in the Beyond 50 world, as well as upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.